The Copilot failure. Microsoft has literally been spending hundreds of billions of dollars on Copilot, and it is not going well.
Ladies and gentlemen, you know why I don't like having all this Copilot crap stuffed into my operating system?
Copilot, the worst thing that Microsoft has developed, even worse than Windows 8 and Windows Vista.
Stop shoving Copilot down their throats, because this AI war is getting more ugly than the one from Terminator.
Microsoft is watching billions of dollars evaporate on an AI product that the overwhelming majority of its users did not ask for and are actively working around, and the internal damage that is causing is becoming increasingly difficult to contain behind polished press releases. Copilot, forced onto millions of PCs through updates that treated user preference as irrelevant, has fractured trust, disrupted professional workflows across industries, and produced a series of enterprise-level embarrassments that have made the product's failure impossible to frame as a rollout challenge. Users are not quietly tolerating the imposition. They are leaving Windows, ignoring AI prompts and numbers that show up in Microsoft's own metrics, and organizing around alternatives with an energy that the company's leadership clearly did not model when it made the decision to embed Copilot everywhere. Simultaneously, the AI bet that was supposed to define Microsoft's next era is currently doing something else entirely, defining the limits of how far a company can push its users before they stop pushing back and simply leave.
As you may have heard recently, that Microsoft will be relenting on Copilot, both with the Copilot button in Office, as well as the physical Copilot key on the keyboard. That's right, if you remember, Microsoft introduced Copilot Plus PCs with AI technologies at their core.
Microsoft spent decades constructing the most dominant operating system in the history of personal computing, and the loyalty it generated across that time was built on a foundation of tolerance rather than enthusiasm. Windows-powered hospitals and trading floors and government agencies and the bedrooms of a billion people who accepted its limitations as the price of using the platform that ran everything. The crashes were tolerated. The sluggish update cycles were tolerated. The bloated system registries and the endless driver conflicts were tolerated. They were tolerated because for most of that period, the alternative felt genuinely inaccessible. And Microsoft understood that inaccessibility was one of its most valuable competitive advantages. Then, decision by decision, Microsoft began making the alternative feel not just accessible but increasingly necessary. That shift did not happen overnight, but it has been accelerating. And the company appears not to have registered how far along it was until the metrics became impossible to explain away.
So according to Valesio, less than 3% of paying users actively use Copilot. One, I didn't know anybody clicked the Copilot button because typically if you're using the Windows utility, you just immediately just disable that and never see it again.
When a Microsoft executive posted on LinkedIn celebrating Windows evolving into what was described as an agentic operating system powered by, the response that followed was not what the post was designed to generate. The comment section filled with users who had been loyal to Windows for 20 and 30 years. And what they wrote was not enthusiasm or curiosity. It was a detailed and precise inventory of accumulated frustrations, system instability, that had gotten worse with each update cycle, privacy features nobody had consented to, AI integrations consuming RAM, and processing power that users needed for the work they were actually trying to do. The post went viral, but not in the direction that any communications team would celebrate. Microsoft had spent considerable resources generating what it interpreted as engagement and momentum around its AI direction. What the LinkedIn comments revealed was that the noise it had been mistaking for applause was something else entirely, and that the mistake had been compounding quietly for longer than anyone inside the company had been willing to say aloud.
And kind of gaslighting all their users into thinking they should be liking this stuff, which I think there maybe is a place for some AI features to be well enjoyed, but I don't think anything Microsoft is doing seems to be well received by people. And maybe it's an issue of Microsoft and not of the people.
Microsoft's response to the sustained user backlash against Copilot's integration into core Windows functions arrived slowly, reluctantly, and without the scope that the criticism warranted. Remapping options were eventually made available. Pinning adjustments were eventually permitted. The concessions were real but narrow, and they arrived after the damage to user sentiment had already registered in data that could not be softened through careful messaging. Copilot's accuracy net promoter score sat at 3.5 in July 2025. By September 2025, it had fallen to negative 24.1. That trajectory, on a product Microsoft had positioned as the centerpiece of its entire forward identity. It is not a metric that gets explained away with language about early adoption curves. It is a signal that the product's relationship with its intended users was fundamentally broken. and that the fixes being applied were not reaching the depth of the problem.
And to celebrate users losing the right to control their computers, they literally lost the right control on their computers. And it was replaced by the Copilot key, a dedicated button just to open the Copilot app. That's right, at Microsoft, we managed to make a key even more useless than this one that you find on an international keyboard.
When Windows 10 support ended on October 14, 2025, Microsoft anticipated that the deadline would function as the final push, converting holdouts into Windows 11 users. What actually happened was something the company had not modeled with adequate seriousness. Linux distributions designed to replicate the visual familiarity of the Windows experience recorded over 1 million migrations within the first 7 days after the support deadline passed. The people making those migrations were not developers making ideological statements about open source software. They were not engineers exploring technical alternatives out of professional curiosity. They were ordinary users who had been accumulating frustrations about forced updates, privacy practices they had not agreed to, and performance that had been declining on hardware that had no business struggling.
Things must be pretty bad at Microsoft right now. Their CEO, Satya Nadella, is basically begging you to use their AI slop. Yes, he's begging you to use the MicroSlop, the Copilot AI, because if you don't use it, guys, oh my God, what's going to happen? The AI bubble is going to burst.
What those ordinary users discovered when they arrived on Linux was that the barrier they had always assumed was too high to clear had quietly been lowered to a level they could step over without technical expertise. Community organizations ran targeted outreach campaigns specifically designed for people arriving from Windows. Ubuntu forums filled with first-time Linux users posting accounts of successful transitions that had taken an afternoon rather than a weekend. The brutal irony that the tech community noticed almost immediately was that Microsoft had spent years making Linux easier to access through the Windows subsystem for Linux, a feature designed to give developers Linux tools without leaving the Windows environment. That investment had inadvertently familiarized an enormous population of users with Linux enough to make a full migration feel significantly less intimidating when they finally had sufficient motivation to attempt it. Microsoft had built the on-ramp to the road it was trying to keep people off.
And like I just said, this is coming off all of the backlash with people saying they don't want this crazy AI stuff that doesn't seem to work well inside of their operating system.
The TPM 2.0 requirement that Microsoft enforced as the hardware threshold for Windows 11 eligibility locked out hundreds of millions of machines that had been running Windows 10 without any performance issues. Users who had purchased computers 4 or 5 years before the announcement were told their hardware was incompatible, not because it lacked the processing power or memory to run the new operating system, but because Microsoft needed a policy-based mechanism to drive hardware refresh cycles and create demand for the Copilot plus PC product line it was simultaneously bringing to market. When those users discovered that their officially incompatible machines could run Linux distributions at full performance with no hardware restrictions whatsoever, the calculation they faced became very simple. The machines worked perfectly. Microsoft had decided they did not qualify. Linux disagreed. And for a growing number of people who had run out of reasons to prioritize Microsoft's commercial interests over their own, Linux's position was the more compelling one.
If you're using Windows 11, your computer has a TPM chip, Trusted Platform Module version 2. This thing is required now to run Windows 11 and is supposed to be a security feature.